My name doesn't matter yet. What matters is the sound. Engines. At 2 a.m. Trucks rolling onto my land. By sunrise, a paved road cut through my grandfather's orchard. No permit. No mercy. I'm the villain of their story until I wasn't. I'm Emma Hale, 34, and I run the last working orchard in Millbrook Hollow on 11 acres my grandfather Walt cleared by hand in 1961. I share the farmhouse with my husband Jake, our daughter Lily, and a stubborn mortgage. The land isn't just soil to me. It's the only inheritance that ever meant anything. Next door sits Cedar Hollow Estates, 42 identical beige houses built 6 years ago on what used to be the Pruitt Dairy Farm. I never wanted trouble with them. I waved at their kids, sold them peaches at the farm stand, let their dogs sniff my fence line. I thought good neighbors just needed distance and courtesy. The HOA president was Deborah Voss, a real estate agent who moved in the year the subdivision opened and somehow controlled the board within 18 months. She wore visors even indoors and referred to Cedar Hollow as my community in every sentence, as if she'd built it herself with her bare, manicured hands. At first Deborah's notes were harmless. A request to trim a hedge, a suggestion my chicken coop smelled a touch rustic. I laughed them off. Jake said she just liked being important. I figured a woman who alphabetized her Tupperware probably needed hobbies. And being the queen of 42 beige houses was hers. The trouble started with the cul-de-sac. Cedar Hollow had one exit onto Route 9. And during harvest season the produce trucks backed traffic up past her cornice-trimmed porch. Deborah began timing my deliveries with a stopwatch. Literally, standing at her mailbox with a clipboard like she was grading a parking test I hadn't signed up for. She started a petition. Residents for Responsible Farm Traffic, and slid it under 42 doors. Most neighbors just wanted the noise to stop by 7. Deborah wanted something bigger. She wanted a second exit, one that happened to run straight through the middle of my working orchard, saving her subdivision 4 minutes to the highway. At the first town hall, she presented a map with a dotted line slicing through my northern field, labeled Proposed Community Access Corridor. I asked, politely, who had approved cutting through private property. She smiled the smile people wear right before they lie to you and said, "It's practically already ours, sweetheart. Just formalities left." I should have known then. Someone unsure of her ground. She argued like someone who already believed she'd won. Months before any vote, any permit, any signature. Jake squeezed my hand under the table and whispered that no county would ever approve paving through an agricultural deed. He was wrong about the timeline, not the danger. My grandfather Walt's original 1961 deed contained one line Deborah's people kept circling in red ink during meetings. A decades old, informal handshake path the dairy trucks once used to reach the old creamery. It had been grass and mud for 30 years, and used since the creamery closed. Deborah called it an existing right-of-way. I called it a cowpath. County zoning records were a mess from decades of small-town paperwork. And Deborah, being a licensed agent, knew exactly which clerk's desk to haunt. She started showing up at the county office in blazers, just checking on some documentation, always smiling at the same tired clerk near retirement who signed things faster than he read them. Meanwhile, in the neighborhood group chat, I became the orchard woman blocking community progress. a phrase Deborah coined herself and repeated until people believed she'd invented traffic problems out of nothing but civic concern. Parents who'd bought my apples for years started avoiding eye contact at the farm stand. I told myself it would blow over by fall. My neighbor Tom Reyes, a retired county surveyor 2 properties down, pulled me aside one evening. "Watch her," he said quietly. "She did this before. Different subdivision, different family. Cut a drainage ditch through an old widow's garden before anyone could stop her. Woman moved out of state within a year. Humiliated. I filed that warning away. Uneasy. I did what any reasonable person does. I emailed the county planning office asking for written confirmation that no easement existed on my property beyond the noted 1961 access path, and that any new road required my written consent and a full permit review. The response took 3 weeks. It said, plainly, no such easement existed for vehicular paving. I felt safe. Deborah's husband, Richard Voss, ran a small land development consultancy nobody in Cedar Hollow seemed to ask questions about. He specialized in value-add corridor projects, a phrase I didn't understand yet. Printed on business cards he handed out at the same town hall where his wife presented her dotted line map like a gift to the neighborhood. I noticed Richard measuring the tree line behind my orchard with a laser tool one Sunday morning. No permission asked. No explanation offered. When I walked over, he simply said, "Preliminary survey work. Don't mind me," folded his tripod, and left without another word, like a man who already knew he'd be back with a crew and no apology. By late August, the HOA newsletter ran a feature titled A Path Forward for Cedar Hollow, describing the Community Corridor Initiative as already in final planning stages, with an artist's rendering of a paved road cutting straight through what was unmistakably my orchard rows. No permit had ever been approved. I stared at that rendering for a long time, feeling something shift. I called Deborah directly, cheerful, as if she'd been waiting. I asked why the newsletter described a road through my land as settled. "Because it basically is," she said. "The board voted unanimously. We're just waiting on paperwork. You'll thank us once your delivery trucks aren't backing up traffic anymore." I told her no board vote overrides private property law, and that I had written confirmation from the county that no easement existed. Deborah's voice dropped its sugar. "Emma, honey, sometimes what's legal and what's practical are 2 different conversations. I'd hate for this to get uncomfortable for you and that sweet little girl of yours." That last line landed like a slap. I hung up shaking, not from fear exactly, but disbelief that a woman selling 3-bedroom colonials could threaten a mother this casually over a road. Jake wanted to call a lawyer immediately. I told him to wait, convinced reason would eventually win against a woman armed with nothing but a clipboard and confidence. 2 days later, surveyor stakes appeared along my northern field line. Small orange flags marching in a straight, arrogant row through soil my grandfather had turned by hand. No notice on my door. No certified letter. Planted like a flag of conquest, cheerfully announcing a war I hadn't agreed to fight yet. I pulled every stake myself before breakfast, dropped them in a bucket, and photographed the empty field for the record. By afternoon, new stakes appeared in the exact same spots, driven deeper this time, as if someone had anticipated my anger and simply doubled down, unbothered, like removing them had only confirmed their plan was working. I filed a formal complaint with the county the same week, citing unauthorized surveying on private agricultural land. The clerk who took my complaint sounded almost embarrassed, mentioning offhand that Mrs. Voss's paperwork looked mostly in order from her last visit. I asked to see that paperwork. Suddenly, appointments kept getting rescheduled, week after week after week. Tom Reyes came by one evening with an old surveyor's logbook from his county years, flipping to a page showing the original 1961 handshake path. This was drawn as seasonal foot access only, he said, tapping the faded ink. Nothing here supports paving, culverts, or vehicle load. If she's citing this for a road, she's stretching it past breaking. I asked Tom why he was helping me so carefully, almost cautiously. He looked out toward Cedar Hollow's beige rooftops and said Deborah had once tried something similar with an elderly widow named Ruth Callahan, who'd owned a garden plot before the subdivision existed. Ruth moved away ashamed and broke, he said. Nobody ever helped her fight back in time. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Ruth Callahan, a woman I'd never met, erased quietly from a town that let a subdivision president decide who belonged and who didn't. I decided then I wouldn't be erased the same way. Whatever Deborah was building toward, I intended to meet it standing, with paperwork of my own. I hired an attorney, Priya Chandrasekharan, who specialized in agricultural land disputes 2 counties over. She reviewed my grandfather's original deed, the county's easement denial letter, and the surveyor stakes photos within a single afternoon. This isn't a gray area, she told me. If they pave without your consent or a real permit, that's trespass and property destruction. Plain and simple. Priya sent Deborah and the HOA board a formal cease and desist letter, laying out the county's written easement denial and warning against unauthorized construction. Deborah's response, forwarded through the HOA's community email list, called it an unfortunate overreaction from a single resident unwilling to compromise for the greater good of 41 other families. The neighborhood group chat turned sharper after that. Someone posted my farm stand's business hours next to a complaint about entitled landowners blocking progress. Another comment joked that I should just let them build the darn road already. I stopped checking the chat. Jake started walking Lily to the bus stop the long way, avoiding Cedar Hollow's main entrance entirely. At the next HOA meeting, which I attended uninvited but within my rights as an adjacent landowner, Deborah presented updated renderings, now including landscaping along the new community corridor, complete with little cartoon trees where my actual, real, decades-old apple trees currently stood. Nobody in the room seemed to register that those trees were mine, alive and rooted. I stood up and asked the board directly whether any member had personally verified county permit approval before authorizing construction planning. Silence. Member, a man named Carl, admitted quietly that Deborah had presented verbal confirmation from the county, not a signed permit. Deborah shot him a look sharp enough to end a career. After the meeting, Carl caught up to me in the parking lot, nervous, glancing over his shoulder like Deborah might materialize from the shrubbery. She told the board the county already approved it, he whispered. But I never saw paperwork. Just her word. Questions before I voted yes. I thanked him and filed that away too. Priya requested official records directly from the county planning department under public disclosure rules, demanding any permit application, environmental review, or engineering assessment related to Cedar Hollow Community Corridor. The response came back 3 weeks later. No application had ever been filed. No permit existed. No review had occurred. Nothing. Building toward a road that legally didn't exist. I brought this to the HOA board in writing, copying every member individually, attaching the county's response confirming 0 permit filings. Deborah's reply, again through the community list, insisted the department was simply behind on paperwork, and that construction planning could proceed in good faith while formalities caught up. Good faith, apparently, meant paving first and asking later. That week, 3 separate delivery trucks tried to park in the exact spot the surveyor stakes marked. Unloading gravel, Deborah insisted, was just for a drainage test. I photographed everything. Jake started sleeping with his phone charged fully overnight. Camera ready. Something in the air had shifted from petty neighborhood squabble into something with real, physical weight bearing down on us. Deborah escalated by mailing certified letters to every Cedar Hollow household, framing me as obstructing a safety project that could delay emergency vehicle response times. She never mentioned there'd never been an approved permit. She never mentioned the county's denial letter. She simply repeated emergency access until neighbors who'd known me for years started calling me reckless, even dangerous. A woman named Patrice, whose kids used to buy cider donuts from my stand every October, stopped me at the mailbox to say she understood both sides, but hoped I'd reconsider for the children's sake. I asked which children were endangered by an unbuilt, unpermitted road. She didn't have an answer. Only Deborah's talking points repeated back at me, word for word. I started recording every interaction after that. Dashcam running whenever I drove past Cedar Hollow. Phone recording every phone call with a legal disclosure at the start. Priya said documentation was our strongest weapon against a woman clearly comfortable rewriting facts in real time for whoever happened to be listening at any given moment. Richard Voss's consultancy filed paperwork under a different LLC name. One I only discovered because Tom recognized the registered agent's address as Richard's own home office. The LLC, Hollow Ridge Development Partners, had quietly optioned 2 adjacent parcels behind my orchard, contingent on improved road access being completed within 18 months. Suddenly the road made a different kind of sense. This wasn't about traffic timing or emergency vehicles at all. Deborah wasn't fighting for 4 minutes off a highway commute. She was clearing a path for her own husband's development deal, one that would triple in value the moment a paved road ran conveniently through what used to be my grandfather's orchard rows. Priya filed this discovery with the county as evidence of conflict of interest, but county officials moved slowly, citing jurisdictional review. Meanwhile, gravel trucks kept idling near my property line every few days, drivers claiming confusion about which lot exactly they'd been dispatched to. The confusion always seemed to land, coincidentally, right at my northern fence. Lily came home from school upset one afternoon because a classmate repeated something her mother said at dinner, that the Orchard family was being greedy and holding up the whole neighborhood. My 8-year-old daughter asked me if we were bad people. I held her for a long time before answering, furious at Deborah in a way I hadn't let myself feel yet. That night I told Jake I was done being polite about this. Politeness had gotten us certified letters calling us hazards, a daughter questioning her own family's decency, and gravel trucks circling our fence line like vultures. Jake nodded slowly. Then let's stop playing her game. he said, and start playing ours. On our own terms. We installed motion-activated cameras along the entire northern property line, feeding directly to cloud storage neither Deborah nor Richard could access or delete. Tom helped us wire 2 additional units near the old creamery path, the exact spot Deborah kept citing as her existing right-of-way. If she came at night, we'd have proof this time. Undeniable proof. Priya sent a second, sharper letter to the full HOA board and to Richard's LLC directly, explicitly warning that any construction activity on my land without written consent and a valid county permit would result in immediate legal action for trespass and destruction of agricultural property. She copied the county attorney's office for good measure, establishing a clear paper trail. Deborah's response arrived not by letter but by a knock on my door. Alone, without her usual clipboard armor. She stood on my porch and said quietly, almost gently, "You're making this so much harder than it needs to be, Emma. Everyone in Cedar Hollow just wants this settled." "Don't you want to be a good neighbor?" I asked her, just as quietly, whether a good neighbor pays a husband's development company to profit off land that isn't theirs. Her expression flickered, just for a second, something raw beneath the visor and the smile. Then it closed again, smooth as always. "I don't know what you think you know," she said, "but you'll regret this." That threat sat heavy in my chest for days. Priya said threats delivered in person, without witnesses, meant little legally. But Tom suggested I start keeping a written log with timestamps of every encounter, just in case. I began writing everything down that same night. The porch conversation first, word for word, while it was still fresh and burning. The following week, someone reported my chicken coop to county code enforcement for unpermitted livestock structures, an accusation that hadn't surfaced once in 11 years of the same coop standing in the same spot. The inspector who arrived seemed almost apologetic, admitting the complaint had come from a Cedar Hollow resident. Name withheld per policy. I didn't need the name, or that complaint had come from. Deborah was diversifying her attacks now, testing which pressure points might finally break me. Harassment complaints, code violations, whisper campaigns among neighbors, all while the real road project sat illegally unpermitted, waiting for a moment of weakness she could exploit. Priya pointed out something useful buried in the county's own records. Cedar Hollow's original subdivision approval, 6 years earlier, had included a signed environmental covenant protecting the creek buffer zone running along my northern field. Any paved road crossing that buffer would violate the subdivision's own founding permit, the one Deborah herself had once celebrated at a ribbon cutting. I photographed the creek buffer myself that weekend, cataloging every native plant species listed in the original covenant, cross-referencing it against county environmental records. If Deborah's road crossed that buffer, and Tom confirmed the surveyor stakes ran directly through it, she wasn't just trespassing on my land. She was violating the very document that let Cedar Hollow legally exist. Carl, the nervous board member from the parking lot, reached out again, this time by encrypted messaging app, saying he'd found something in the HOA's financial records that troubled him deeply. Deborah had authorized a $5,000 consulting deposit to Hollow Ridge Development Partners months before any board vote on the road had even occurred, without disclosure. That deposit meant Deborah had personally committed HOA funds to her own husband's shell company before the community had ever formally approved the project. Before any permit existed, before anyone outside her inner circle understood the scale of what she was building toward. Carl said he was terrified of what would happen if she found out he'd shared this. I asked Priya what this meant legally. She said it strengthened everything: conflict of interest, unauthorized fund allocation, and potential fraud against the HOA's own members, most of whom had no idea their dues were quietly funding a road designed to benefit Deborah's household directly, at my expense, and possibly at theirs too. For a few weeks, an uneasy quiet settled over Cedar Hollow. No new stakes, no gravel trucks, no certified letters. Deborah went strangely silent on the community chat, and I let myself believe, foolishly, that documentation and legal letters had finally slowed her down. Tom warned me quiet like this usually meant something worse was coming, not less. During that lull, I focused on the orchard itself, bringing in the late harvest with Jake and 2 seasonal workers we'd hired for years. Lily rode the tractor beside me one afternoon, laughing at nothing in particular, and for an hour I forgot Deborah existed at all. Forgot roads and stakes and shell companies, remembered only apples and sunlight. Priya used the quiet period to formally request an emergency injunction from the county, citing the environmental covenant violation and the lack of any valid permit, asking a judge to explicitly bar construction on my property until the matter could be properly reviewed. A hearing date was set for 6 weeks out, longer than any of us wanted. Tom mentioned, almost casually one evening over coffee, that Ruth Callahan, the widow Deborah had pushed out years earlier, still lived 2 towns over. He said if I ever wanted to understand exactly how far Deborah was willing to go, Ruth would know better than anyone alive. I wrote her name down and told myself I'd call her eventually, when I had time. I didn't have to wait. Having heard through an old church friend still living in Cedar Hollow that the orchard woman was fighting the same battle she'd once lost. Her voice on the phone was careful, guarded, like someone still flinching years after the wound had supposedly healed over completely. Ruth told me Deborah had once convinced the county, through a friendly contact in the permitting office, to fast-track a drainage easement through her garden, using forged consent language Ruth swore she'd never signed. By the time Ruth's own lawyer got involved, the ditch was already dug, her garden ruined, and legal fees had eaten through her retirement savings entirely. She has someone inside the county office, Ruth warned me. Someone who signs things without reading them. Or worse, someone who owes her something. Don't trust any paperwork with her name near it, even documents that look official. Check everything twice, 3 times, before you believe a single word that woman puts on paper. That warning changed how I approached the upcoming injunction hearing entirely. Priya and I began independently verifying every document Deborah's side submitted, cross-checking signatures against known samples, checking notary stamps against actual registered notaries in the county database. Felt paranoid until 3 days before the hearing. The paranoia paid off completely. Buried in Deborah's submitted exhibits was a photocopy of a supposed 1987 addendum to my grandfather's original deed, granting expanded vehicular right-of-way for community development purposes, allegedly signed by Walt Hale himself. My grandfather died in 2003. I'd never seen this document. Neither had my mother, who'd managed the estate for years before passing it to me. I stared at that signature for a long time, My grandfather signed his name with a distinctive looping W, a habit from decades of signing crop contracts the same way every single time. This signature's W leaned the wrong direction entirely, rigid and unfamiliar, like someone had practiced from a sample but never quite captured the muscle memory beneath it. Priya hired a forensic document examiner within 2 days, a woman named Dr. Okafor, who specialized in signature authentication for contested estates. Dr. The 1987 signature against 14 verified samples from my grandfather's actual crop contracts spanning 3 decades. Her preliminary finding, delivered by phone, made my hands shake. The signature was almost certainly forged. Almost certainly became conclusively for days later. Once Dr. Okafor completed her full report, identifying inconsistent pen pressure, unnatural letter spacing, and stroke patterns inconsistent with my grandfather's documented handwriting across every decade of his life. Someone had forged a dead man's signature to manufacture a right-of-way that had never legally existed at all. I asked Priya the obvious question: who benefits from forging my dead grandfather's signature on a document conveniently discovered right when Deborah needed it most? Priya's answer was simple: whoever needed this easement to exist badly enough to risk fraud. And whoever had access to your grandfather's actual signature samples to copy from in the first place. That detail nagged at me for days. Where would Deborah have found samples of my grandfather's actual signature to forge from convincingly enough to nearly fool an untrained eye? The county's own property tax archive, I realized eventually, held decades of his notarized filings, publicly accessible to anyone willing to request copies and study them closely. Carl confirmed, through another careful encrypted message, that Deborah had requested archived property tax documents for my parcel 8 months earlier, officially for community planning research, a request the county clerk had approved without asking a single follow-up question. 8 months ago was exactly when the existing right-of-way language first appeared in her newsletters. Priya filed the forensic report immediately with the county and the presiding judge ahead of the injunction hearing, formally alleging document fraud and requesting the matter be referred for criminal investigation. She warned me this would likely provoke Deborah into something reckless. People cornered by fraud allegations, Priya said, rarely respond with calm, measured grace. Priya was right. My cameras caught movement along the northern fence line at 11:47 p.m., headlights approaching slowly, deliberately, without any Cedar Hollow guest passes typically required after dark. I woke Jake immediately, and we watched together on the monitor as 3 unmarked trucks rolled up to the exact spot the surveyor stakes once marked. We called the county sheriff's non-emergency line, but the dispatcher said no unit was immediately available, a response time of possibly 90 minutes given the rural coverage area. Jake wanted to drive out there with a flashlight and confront them directly. I told him no, that Priya had warned us repeatedly. Document everything, confront nothing, let the cameras do the fighting. By the time we finished arguing over whether to go outside, the trucks had already unloaded equipment onto the field, headlights cutting sharp beams across rows of apple trees my grandfather had planted before my mother was even born. I recognized one truck's logo immediately: Blacktop Brothers, a small paving company owned by Deborah's own brother-in-law, Danny Voss. We stayed inside, cameras rolling, phones recording, adrenaline making the next 4 hours feel simultaneously endless and instant. Around 2 a.m., Heavy equipment engines roared to life across our property line, and the unmistakable smell of hot asphalt began drifting through our open bedroom window. Thick and acrid, impossible to ignore or explain away as anything else. Sleep was impossible after that. Jake and I sat at the kitchen table watching live camera feeds, saying almost nothing, occasionally texting Tom updates he read from 2 properties away with his own porch light on. Unable to sleep either. Around 4 a.m., the paving crew's foreman actually knocked on our door, asking if we wanted the entrance angled differently. I told him, as calmly as I could manage, that this was my private agricultural property, that no valid permit existed, and that he and his crew needed to stop immediately or face serious legal consequences. He shrugged, almost sympathetic. "Lady, I just go where the paperwork says. Mrs. showed us signed county approval this morning. Take it up with her." Signed county approval. Apparently, materializing exactly when Deborah needed it. Exactly like the 1987 forgery had appeared exactly when she needed that too. I photographed the paperwork the foreman showed me. A blurry printout with a signature block I didn't recognize from any county official Priya and I had dealt with throughout this entire ordeal. By sunrise, roughly 140 feet of fresh asphalt cut cleanly through my northern field, still steaming faintly in the cool morning air, flattening rows of apple trees my grandfather had planted the same year he married my grandmother. I stood at the edge of it, coffee cold in my hand, and felt something inside me go very, very still. Jake found me standing there 20 minutes later, silent, staring at the black scar running through decades of family history like it had always belonged there. He put his hand on my shoulder and said nothing at first, because there was nothing gentle left to say about what had just happened to something we couldn't get back. Priya arrived within the hour, having driven straight from home the moment I called her, still in yesterday's clothes. She walked the length of the new pavement slowly, photographing everything, noting exact GPS coordinates against the Environmental Covenant's protected creek buffer zone, confirming what Tom had suspected weeks earlier. The road crossed directly through legally protected wetland territory. "This isn't just trespass anymore," Priya said, crouching near the asphalt's edge where it disturbed the creek buffer's native plantings. "This is environmental covenant violation, document fraud, and construction without permit, all in one overnight operation. She just handed us everything we needed to destroy her, and she did it in the dark, thinking no one would see." Deborah, meanwhile, posted triumphantly to the Cedar Hollow community chat by 8 a.m., announcing wonderful news about the completed safety corridor, thanking our dedicated development partners for their swift work, and inviting residents to enjoy their new shortcut to Route 9, starting immediately. No more waiting on outdated obstacles standing in our community's way. I read that message 3 times, standing in my own destroyed field, still smelling asphalt fumes, and felt something shift from grief into something colder, sharper, more useful. Deborah had just publicly celebrated an unpermitted, fraudulently authorized road built overnight through protected wetland and stolen private property. In writing, time-stamped, screenshot-able, permanent, Priya filed emergency motions that same morning, a temporary restraining order barring anyone from using the new road, a formal fraud complaint regarding the forged 1987 signature, and a criminal referral for the falsified county permit the foreman had shown me. The judge, reviewing everything within hours given the severity, granted the restraining order by early afternoon. Deborah's crew had barely finished cleaning their equipment before county sheriff's deputies arrived to post the restraining order signage directly across her brand new road, blocking Cedar Hollow's excited residents from ever actually using their celebrated shortcut. I watched from my porch as several confused neighbors gathered near the barricade, reading the order, whispering among themselves. By evening, whispers in the Cedar Hollow chat had shifted noticeably. Someone asked, quietly, whether the county had actually approved the permit Deborah kept referencing. Another resident mentioned overhearing Carl at the mailbox saying something about financial irregularities in the HOA's books. The unified anger that once aimed entirely at me was beginning, finally, to fracture. Deborah responded to the restraining order publicly, calling it a temporary bureaucratic hiccup orchestrated by one bitter landowner determined to punish an entire community for her own selfishness. She never mentioned the forged signature. She never mentioned her husband's shell company. She never mentioned the $5,000 deposit Carl had discovered months earlier, waiting quietly in HOA records. That night, sitting with Jake in the kitchen, I made a decision I'd been circling for weeks without admitting it fully to myself. I wasn't going to wait for courts and permits and slow-moving justice to undo what Deborah had done overnight. If she could act decisively under cover of darkness, so, eventually, could I? Priya cautioned patience, reminding me the criminal referral and fraud complaint were moving forward properly through legitimate channels. That impulsive action could jeopardize everything we built toward a real, lasting legal victory. I told her I understood, and mostly, I did. But standing at that black scar every morning was becoming harder than any legal timeline could soothe. 2 weeks passed with the restraining order holding, the road sitting unused behind sheriff's barricades while investigators reviewed the forged signature and falsified permit claims. Deborah, undeterred, began a new campaign, this time targeting Priya directly, filing a bar complaint alleging conflict of interest based on nothing more than Priya once buying apples at my stand. The bar complaint went nowhere, dismissed within days as baseless, but it revealed something important. Deborah wasn't just fighting for a road anymore. She was fighting to punish anyone who'd helped expose her, methodically working through everyone connected to me, one manufactured grievance at a time, like a woman used to winning through sheer exhausting persistence. Carl reached out again, more shaken this time, saying Deborah had confronted him privately, accusing him of betraying the board and hinting that his small landscaping business, which depended heavily on Cedar Hollow contracts, might struggle to find work locally if certain loyalties weren't reconsidered soon. It was, unmistakably, a threat wrapped in pleasant language. I told Carl to document that conversation immediately, exactly the way Tom had taught me weeks earlier. Timestamps and direct quotes while memory stayed fresh. Priya added his statement to our growing file, now thick enough that she'd started organizing it by category: fraud, trespass, environmental violation, witness intimidation, financial misconduct, a portrait of someone unraveling in real time. Ruth Callahan called again, this time offering something unexpected. She still had, tucked away in a storage unit, a folder of old correspondence from her own ordeal with Deborah years earlier, including an email where Deborah had bragged, in writing, about handling the permit situation creatively regarding Ruth's ditch. Ruth offered to dig it out and send copies. That folder arrived by mail 4 days later. Yellowed pages and printed emails documenting a pattern stretching back years. Deborah exploiting friendly county contacts, manufacturing paperwork, threatening reluctant neighbors, always careful never to leave anything too explicitly incriminating, except for that one bragging email, sent late at night, clearly written by someone who believed she'd never truly be caught. Priya was ecstatic reviewing Ruth's folder, calling it a pattern of conduct that would matter enormously if this case ever reached trial or sentencing. Prosecutors, she explained, cared deeply about whether fraud was a single desperate mistake or a repeated, deliberate strategy. Ruth's documents proved decisively it was the latter, a career built on exploiting powerless neighbors. Meanwhile, county investigators finally interviewed the clerk who'd approved Deborah's archive document requests months earlier. Under questioning, he admitted, nervously, that Deborah had brought him coffee most Tuesdays for over a year, and that he'd occasionally expedited her requests as a professional courtesy, without fully verifying every detail the way protocol technically required him to. That clerk wasn't necessarily corrupt, just tired and flattered, exactly the kind of vulnerability Ruth had warned me about months earlier. Deborah hadn't needed a criminal conspirator inside the county office. She'd only needed someone lonely enough to appreciate a friendly face and a warm cup of coffee, willing to look the other way just slightly, just enough. Investigators also traced the falsified county permit shown to the paving foreman back to a document template that closely matched official county formatting, but used a signature block belonging to a retired county official who'd left the position 2 years earlier. Someone had either forged that signature too, or an old template had been recycled deceptively, deliberately, to fool an unsuspecting crew. Danny Voss, Deborah's brother-in-law who owned Blacktop Brothers, was interviewed separately by investigators and immediately began distancing himself, claiming Deborah's team had provided all necessary documentation and that he'd trusted his own sister-in-law's word entirely. His statement, intended to protect himself, only reinforced how thoroughly Deborah had orchestrated every piece of this operation personally. Richard Voss remained conspicuously silent throughout, issuing no public statements, appearing at no HOA meetings, his development consultancy's website quietly taken offline within days of the restraining order. Priya noted this as consciousness of guilt, the classic behavior of someone realizing their carefully built financial scheme was collapsing faster than they'd ever anticipated it could. The HOA board, sensing the ground shifting beneath them, called an emergency session without Deborah's knowledge, using an obscure bylaw allowing 3 members to convene independently if the president faced credible allegations of misconduct affecting community welfare. Carl, finally done being afraid, was the one who invoked it, reading the bylaw aloud with a steady voice. I wasn't invited to that meeting, being a non-resident, but Tom's wife, a longtime Cedar Hollow homeowner, attended and later described it to me in detail. Board members reviewing the $5,000 deposit records, the forged signature findings, the falsified permit, growing visibly paler with each revelation, realizing their community dues had funded something far worse than a shortcut. By the meeting's end, the board voted 5-1 to suspend Deborah's presidency pending the outcome of the fraud investigation, citing violation of fiduciary duty and conflict of interest regarding Hollow Ridge development partners. Only Deborah's closest ally on the board, a woman named Priscilla, voted against suspension, calling the whole situation a witch hunt. Deborah reportedly learned about her suspension not from the board directly, but from the community chat, where Carl posted a brief, careful announcement about leadership changes pending an ongoing review. Within an hour, she deleted her account entirely, though not before firing off one final message calling the entire board cowards, and me the real criminal here. That message, screenshotted by at least 6 residents before deletion, spread through Cedar Hollow faster than any HOA newsletter ever had. People who'd once avoided eye contact with me at the farm stand started sending apologetic texts, admitting they'd believed Deborah's version of events without ever questioning it, embarrassed now at how easily her confidence had convinced them. Patrice, the mother who'd once asked me to reconsider for the children's sake, showed up at my farm stand unannounced, apologizing quietly while buying a dozen apples she didn't really need. I should have asked more questions, she admitted. She was just so certain about everything. It made it easy to believe her instead of looking closer myself. I accepted her apology, though something in me stayed guarded. Trust, once fractured by a neighborhood united against you over a lie, doesn't rebuild instantly just because the lie collapses. I told Patrice I appreciated her honesty, and meant it, but I wasn't ready yet to pretend the last several months hadn't happened to my family. Priya warned me, correctly, that Deborah wasn't finished, that people who'd built entire identities around always winning rarely surrendered gracefully once cornered. Watch for something desperate, she said. Suspended presidents with nothing left to lose sometimes do the most reckless things imaginable, especially ones who've apparently gotten away with this exact pattern before, unchallenged. Sure enough, 3 nights after her suspension, my cameras caught Deborah herself, alone this time, walking the length of the illegal road at nearly midnight, flashlight in hand, examining something near the restraining order barricade. Jake wanted to call the sheriff immediately. I told him to wait, curious what exactly she was doing out there alone. The footage later showed her attempting to remove the restraining order signage herself, tearing at the zip ties securing it to temporary posts, muttering audibly to herself, words the camera's microphone couldn't quite capture clearly. When a post wouldn't budge, she kicked it hard enough to nearly fall, then stood there breathing heavily in the cold night air. I sent that footage to Priya first thing the next morning, along with the sheriff's department. Tampering with a court-ordered restraining barricade, Priya explained, constituted a separate criminal offense entirely, contempt of court at minimum, potentially obstruction depending on how prosecutors chose to pursue it. Deborah had just handed investigators yet another piece of evidence. Unprompted, deputies visited Deborah's home that afternoon, and according to Tom's wife, who watched from her porch, Deborah answered the door still in pajamas, visibly startled, her usual composed confidence noticeably absent. She was cited for violating the restraining order and warned that any further tampering would result in immediate arrest. Not just a citation this time. That citation seemed to finally rattle something loose in her. Community chat screenshots, still circulating despite her account's deletion, showed she'd begun texting individual board members directly, alternating between apologetic pleading and furious accusations. insisting the entire situation was a conspiracy between me, Carl, and outside agitators determined to destroy everything she'd built for Cedar Hollow. Carl forwarded me one particularly telling message where Deborah wrote, "In a moment of unguarded panic, I only did what was necessary for this community's future, and for my family's future too. And none of you understand what real leadership costs." It was the closest thing to an admission she'd ever put in writing, unprompted and unforced. Priya added that message to our growing case file, noting it demonstrated consciousness of wrongdoing without requiring interpretation. "Real leadership," she said dryly, reading it aloud at her office, "apparently costs a forged dead man's signature and a wetland violation. I'll be sure to mention that phrasing specifically when this eventually reaches a judge's desk." Meanwhile, the county's criminal investigation formally expanded once forensic document examiners confirmed the falsified permit signature block belonged to a retired official who'd never authorized its use. Investigators now suspected Deborah had recycled an old document template from her years working adjacent to permit offices during her real estate career, editing it convincingly enough to fool an untrained crew foreman. Danny Voss, facing potential liability himself for operating without a verified valid permit, quietly hired his own attorney and began cooperating with investigators, providing texts between himself and Deborah discussing getting this done quietly before anyone official gets involved properly. Those texts, time-stamped weeks before the overnight paving, proved clear premeditation, not panic or confusion. I learned through Priya that prosecutors were now considering multiple charges: forgery of a legal document, filing false instruments with a government entity, criminal mischief for the destroyed orchard trees, and environmental code violations for the wetland damage. Deborah, facing potential real consequences for the first time in what Ruth's folder suggested was a long-standing pattern, hired a defense attorney immediately. Her attorney's first move was requesting a meeting with Priya, floating the possibility of a private settlement to make the civil matter go away quietly in exchange for dropping cooperation with the criminal investigation. Priya refused outright, telling me later that quiet settlements existed to protect people like Deborah from consequences, and Ruth Callahan deserved better than that outcome. I agreed completely. About my orchard weeks earlier, it had become about Ruth, forced out of her home in shame years before anyone believed her. It had become about Carl, threatened for simply telling the truth. It had become about an entire neighborhood manipulated by someone who mistook confidence for the right to lie. The HOA board, now operating without Deborah entirely, hired an independent auditor to review years of financial records, uncovering additional irregularities beyond the Hollow Ridge deposit, inflated landscaping invoices, routed suspiciously through companies with addresses matching Voss family properties, community fund withdrawals labeled vaguely as administrative expenses that no board member could actually explain or account for. Those findings triggered a second wave of community outrage, this time entirely directed at Deborah, with residents who'd once defended her fiercely now demanding full financial transparency and, increasingly, criminal accountability. Priscilla, Deborah's last remaining board ally, resigned quietly rather than face growing pressure to explain her earlier votes defending someone now facing multiple potential felony charges. I received an unexpected phone call from a local news reporter, Marisol Vega, who'd heard about the case through county court filings and wanted to interview me for a story about HOA overreach and property fraud. Priya advised caution but ultimately agreed the story could help, especially with criminal charges still pending review by county prosecutors handling the case. I sat down with Marisol on my porch, Lily playing nearby, and told the story plainly. The forged signature, the overnight paving, the threatened neighbors, Ruth Callahan's years-old ordeal finally coming to light. Marisol recorded everything carefully, promising to verify each claim against court documents before publishing anything, unwilling to run unsubstantiated accusations against anyone, however deserved. Her article, published 2 weeks later under the headline, "The HOA President Who Paved Over the Rules," went further than I'd expected, including interviews with Ruth Callahan, Carl, and even the retired county surveyor Tom, painting a complete picture of a pattern stretching back years, hidden in plain sight by someone skilled at appearing endlessly reasonable. The article spread quickly online, shared across local community groups, and eventually picked up by a regional news outlet covering property law disputes. Deborah's defense attorney reportedly called it prejudicial and premature, but Priya noted, correctly, that every fact in the piece traced directly back to court filings, forensic reports, and documented witness statements already on record. Deborah, according to Tom's wife, stopped leaving her house except at odd hours, her once immaculate lawn beginning to show neglect, her mail piling up visibly against the door. The woman who'd once policed neighbors' hedge heights with a clipboard now seemed to be avoiding the very community she'd spent years insisting she alone knew how to lead properly. Richard Voss's development consultancy formally dissolved that month, its LLC filings marked inactive with the state. The option parcels behind my orchard quietly released back to their original owners without explanation. Priya said this likely reflected the collapsing value of any development plan now permanently tied, publicly, to active forgery and fraud investigations against its principal architects. County prosecutors finally announced formal charges against Deborah 6 weeks after the article published. Forgery, filing false instruments, criminal mischief, and environmental code violations. For separate felony counts carrying combined potential penalties Priya described as genuinely significant for someone with no prior criminal record, though clearly, thanks to Ruth, an established pattern of similar conduct. Danny Voss received a lesser charge, operating without a verified permit, resolved through a plea agreement requiring cooperation testimony against Deborah in exchange for reduced penalties and community service. His cooperation, prosecutors noted, provided crucial corroborating evidence for the premeditation charge. The timestamped texts proving this had been planned deliberately, not panicked or improvised in the moment. The arraignment hearing was scheduled downtown, and I attended with Jake, sitting several rows back, watching Deborah enter in a plain gray suit. No visor, no clipboard, none of the armor she'd worn through every Cedar Hollow meeting where she'd once seemed untouchable. Her attorney entered a not guilty plea on all counts, as expected, setting a trial date months out. Outside the courthouse, Marisol Vega caught me for a brief follow-up interview, asking how it felt watching someone who'd threatened my family finally face formal charges. I told her it felt less like victory and more like relief, the exhausting weight of months spent documenting, recording, and defending finally shifting toward something resembling actual justice. Slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely moving forward. Ruth Callahan called that evening, having read Marisol's article herself, crying softly on the phone. "Nobody believed me back then," she said. "I thought I just imagined how bad it really was. That maybe I'd overreacted to a woman just doing her job a little too aggressively." I told her she hadn't imagined anything, that the record now proved it clearly, permanently. Priya filed our civil suit formally alongside the criminal proceedings, seeking damages for destroyed orchard trees, restoration costs for the wetland violation, and compensation for months of harassment and reputational harm. She estimated the total damages, once expert arborists assessed the destroyed tree's age and value, would likely exceed what Deborah's household could realistically absorb without significant financial consequences. An arborist named Dr. Feldman visited the orchard that week, examining the scarred field where asphalt had replaced 40-year-old apple trees overnight. His assessment was somber. Several trees, planted the year my grandparents married, were irreplaceable at any price, their age and grafting history unique to our specific land, impossible to simply purchase or transplant elsewhere. Reading his report, I found myself crying for the first time since the night the paving happened, not from fresh grief exactly, but from finally having someone official, someone with credentials and authority, confirm in writing what I'd known instinctively standing at that black scar months earlier. Something genuinely irreplaceable had been destroyed, carelessly, for someone else's profit. Jake held me that evening, and for once neither of us tried to talk strategy or legal timelines. We just sat together on the porch, watching Lily chase fireflies near the undamaged southern rose, letting ourselves feel, briefly, the simple grief underneath months of documentation and legal maneuvering, the plain fact that something precious had been taken. Priya, sensing my exhaustion, suggested I take a step back from daily case involvement for a while, letting her and the prosecutors handle the mounting paperwork without my constant attention. I agreed gratefully, spending the following weeks focused on harvest, on Lily, on simply existing in my own orchard without cameras, lawyers, or courtroom dates dominating every waking thought. That reprieve didn't last uninterrupted, though it felt necessary regardless. Marisol's article had drawn attention from a state consumer protection office, which reached out to Priya inquiring whether other Cedar Hollow residents might have unknowingly funded fraudulent HOA expenditures through their dues, opening a broader inquiry into how deeply Deborah's misconduct had actually penetrated the community's finances overall. That inquiry revealed something none of us had anticipated. The independent auditor's earlier findings were just the surface. Deeper review uncovered nearly $40,000 in misdirected HOA funds over 3 years, routed through inflated invoices to companies connected to the Voss family. Money residents had paid believing it maintained shared amenities and landscaping. $40,000 represented years of dues from 42 households. Money meant for pool maintenance, shared lawn care, community events, quietly redirected instead toward Deborah and Richard's personal financial interests. When this figure became public, the outrage that had been simmering since Marisol's article erupted into something the HOA board could no longer manage internally at all. An emergency community meeting drew nearly every household, more attendance than any Cedar Hollow gathering in its 6-year history. Residents demanded Deborah's permanent removal from any future board position, full financial restitution, and an independent forensic audit covering every year since the subdivision's founding. Unwilling to trust anything connected to her leadership going forward without complete transparency. Carl, now acting as interim board president, stood before the packed room and read a formal statement acknowledging the board's failure to properly vet Deborah's claims for years, apologizing directly to me and to Ruth Callahan by name, admitting the community had been too quick to trust confidence over actual evidence throughout this entire painful ordeal. That apology meant more to me than I expected it would. I hadn't attended the meeting myself, being a non-resident, but Tom's wife recorded Carl's statement and sent it to me afterward. Hearing my name spoken with genuine regret, rather than the accusations I'd grown used to for months, felt like a small, meaningful turning point finally arriving. Deborah's defense attorney, sensing the mounting public and financial pressure, reportedly approached prosecutors about a plea deal, hoping to resolve the criminal charges before trial with reduced sentencing in exchange for full cooperation and restitution. Prosecutors, emboldened by the expanding financial fraud discoveries, indicated they weren't interested in anything less than significant accountability now. Meanwhile, my restraining order remained in effect, the illegal road still sitting barricaded and unused across my destroyed field, a constant physical reminder every morning when I walked out to check on the surviving orchard rows. Priya explained that removing the asphalt itself would eventually fall to Deborah's restitution obligations, once the legal process fully concluded months down the line. Months, I realized, was a long time to stare at a scar every single morning. Jake noticed it too, the way I'd pause at the kitchen window each day, coffee in hand, looking at that stretch of black pavement cutting through what used to be rows of trees. "It's just sitting there," he said one evening, "waiting for someone else's timeline." That phrase stuck with me for days. Someone else's timeline. I'd spent months documenting, cooperating, waiting patiently for courts and prosecutors and restitution processes to move at their own careful, deliberate pace, exactly as Priya had advised. And that patience had worked. Genuinely, producing real charges, real consequences, real accountability finally catching up to Deborah. But something in me had shifted since that first night watching headlights cross my fence line, watching hot asphalt swallow trees my grandfather planted before my mother was born. I'd spent this entire ordeal reacting, documenting, defending, waiting for permission from lawyers and judges to feel something other than patient, careful restraint about my own stolen land. Tom stopped by one afternoon, noticing the same restless energy Jake had mentioned, and asked directly what was actually bothering me beyond the obvious. I told him honestly, watching that road sit there, undamaged, technically still functional despite the barricades, felt like living beside a monument to everything Deborah had taken, waiting patiently for someone else to remove it eventually. "You know," Tom said carefully, choosing his words like a man who'd thought about this longer than the conversation suggested, "restitution orders take years sometimes, especially against someone facing multiple felony counts with limited assets. That road might sit there considerably longer than you're imagining, unless someone with legal standing over their own property decides otherwise." I asked Priya directly the next morning whether I had any legal right to remove the illegal pavement myself, given it sat entirely on my own private property without any valid permit or easement ever having existed. She paused for a long moment before answering carefully, the way lawyers do when a question sits somewhere genuinely complicated. "Technically," she said slowly, "property owners generally retain rights to remove unauthorized structures from their own land, especially structures built through documented fraud and trespass. But timing matters enormously here. Do it wrong, or too soon, and you risk complicating the very criminal case we've spent months carefully building against her. Do it right, though. She let that sentence trail off, and I understood exactly what she meant without her needing to finish it. This needed to happen carefully, documented properly, timed correctly, not out of impulsive anger but out of clear-eyed, deliberate reclamation of what had always, legally and rightfully, belonged to me and my family alone from the very beginning. I spent the following week gathering everything Priya said I'd need. Written confirmation from the restraining order's terms confirming the road's illegal status, documentation proving no valid easement existed, photographs and video establishing clear boundary lines, and formal notice to the county that I intended to remove unauthorized construction from my own private property, entirely within my rights. Priya reviewed every document twice before approving my plan, making absolutely certain nothing could later be characterized as impulsive vandalism rather than lawful removal of illegally constructed material from private land. Document every single step, she reminded me. Cameras rolling the entire time. This needs to look exactly like what it actually is. Justice, not revenge. I hired a local excavation company, Millbrook Earthworks, run by a woman named Denise who'd known my grandfather decades earlier and remembered him fondly as the only farmer in this county who ever thanked his equipment operators by name. When I explained the situation, Denise didn't hesitate. "Give me a date," she said. "I'll bring the biggest excavator I own." We scheduled the removal for a Saturday morning, notifying the county in advance as Priya recommended, sending formal written notice to the HOA board and, through their attorney, to Deborah herself, informing everyone that unauthorized construction would be removed from private property on the specified date, entirely within established legal rights as documented property owner. That Friday night, I barely slept, though this time from something closer to anticipation than dread. Jake sat with me on the porch until nearly midnight, looking out at the pale strip of asphalt visible under moonlight, the same spot where headlights had once appeared uninvited, months earlier, carrying trucks that changed everything about our quiet, ordinary life. Lily, who'd absorbed more of this ordeal than I'd realized despite our efforts to shield her, asked if she could watch the excavator work in the morning. I told her yes, that this was something worth remembering clearly, a lesson about patience, documentation, and eventually, when the timing was finally right, standing firmly for what actually belonged to you. Saturday arrived clear and cool. Perfect visibility for the cameras Priya insisted we position at multiple angles. Denise's crew arrived at 8 sharp with a massive excavator loaded on a flatbed trailer, its bucket gleaming in early sunlight like something almost ceremonial, a tool about to perform something far more meaningful than ordinary demolition work that morning. Word had apparently spread through Cedar Hollow overnight, because by 8:30, a small crowd had gathered along the subdivision's edge, respectfully distant but clearly curious, watching from beyond the property line as Denise's crew unloaded equipment onto the very field where Deborah's paving crew had once worked secretly under cover of darkness. Months earlier, uninvited, Carl arrived among the crowd, standing quietly near Tom, and gave me a small nod when our eyes met across the field. Patrice was there too, along with several other residents who'd once doubted me, now watching in what looked like genuine solidarity rather than the suspicious distance I'd grown accustomed to throughout this exhausting, painful ordeal. Denise climbed into the excavator's cab herself, waving me over before starting the engine. "You want the honor of the first bucket load?" she asked, grinning. I hadn't expected the offer, but I climbed up beside her without hesitation. Hands steady on the controls, she guided carefully, the engine rumbling to life beneath us both. The first strike of the bucket cracked through asphalt with a sound I felt more than heard, a deep, satisfying shudder traveling up through the machine's frame into my own chest. Chunks of black pavement broke away, exposing raw earth beneath, soil that had waited patiently under stolen asphalt for months to finally breathe open air again. I stepped back after that first strike, letting Denise's experienced crew take over the careful, methodical work of removing the road properly, section by section, preserving soil structure for eventual replanting rather than simply gouging carelessly. Jake stood beside me, filming everything on his phone, occasionally glancing at the small crowd still watching quietly from beyond the fence. By mid-morning, roughly half the illegal road lay broken into manageable chunks, stacked neatly for proper disposal, the exposed earth beneath already looking less like a wound and more like simply bare ground waiting patiently for spring planting. Lily ran along the field's edge, collecting small asphalt fragments in a bucket, calling them pieces of the bad road. Someone in the small crowd, I never learned who exactly, began quietly clapping as another large section broke free from the excavator's bucket. Within moments, several others joined, a soft, spontaneous ripple of applause from neighbors who'd once repeated Deborah's talking points without question, now watching her fraudulent legacy get dismantled piece by satisfying piece. Tom's wife later told me she'd never seen Cedar Hollow residents so unified about anything in 6 years of the subdivision's existence. Not community potlucks, not holiday decorating contests. Nothing had ever drawn this many people together quite like watching illegally poured asphalt get methodically removed from land it never should have touched in the first place. By early afternoon, Denise's crew finished breaking apart the final section, loading the last chunks onto their disposal truck. What remained was simply my field again, scarred with tire tracks and disturbed soil, but unmistakably, finally, mine alone once more. No black scar cutting through it. No reminder of stolen nights and forged signatures visible any longer. Priya arrived that afternoon to formally document the completed removal for our ongoing legal proceedings, photographing every stage from the notice served to the final cleared field, ensuring the entire process remained unimpeachably lawful should Deborah's defense attorney attempt any argument characterizing this as unauthorized destruction rather than legitimate removal of illegal construction. "This actually strengthens our position," Priya explained, reviewing her photographs that evening over coffee at my kitchen table. "You gave proper notice, used a licensed contractor, documented everything, and removed material that a court had already restrained from use due to established fraud. There's nothing here Deborah's attorney can meaningfully spin as anything other than lawful reclamation." News of the removal reached Marisol Vega within days, and she published a brief follow-up piece titled, "Farmer Reclaims Land After HOA's Fraudulent Road Exposed," including photographs Jake had shared of the excavator's first strike breaking through the asphalt. The article's comments section filled quickly with strangers from across the region expressing satisfaction at the story's unfolding justice. Deborah's defense attorney did attempt, as Priya predicted, to characterize the removal negatively in a pretrial motion, calling it inflammatory and prejudicial media coverage designed to bias potential jurors. The judge overseeing the case dismissed the motion quickly, noting the removal had been lawfully conducted with proper notice, entirely separate from the pending criminal proceedings against Deborah herself. That dismissal felt like a small, satisfying vindication. One more moment confirming everything Priya and I had built together over these exhausting months rested on solid legal ground. Not impulsive anger. However justified that anger might have genuinely felt standing beside a bulldozed field where 40-year-old apple trees once grew undisturbed for decades. The trial date arrived roughly 4 months after Deborah's arraignment, and I attended every session Priya's schedule allowed, sitting beside Ruth Callahan, who'd traveled from 2 towns over specifically to watch the woman who'd once destroyed her garden finally face genuine legal accountability for a pattern of conduct stretching back years before I'd ever met her. Prosecutors presented their case methodically over 8 days. Dr. Okafor's forensic signature analysis, Carl's testimony about the falsified verbal permit claims, Danny Voss's cooperating testimony regarding the falsified official permit template, and the independent auditor's financial findings detailing nearly $40,000 in misdirected community funds routed toward Voss family interests over 3 years. Deborah's defense argued she genuinely believed the 1987 addendum existed based on old family recollections, and that the falsified permit represented an overzealous contractor's mistake rather than deliberate fraud on her part. The jury, having heard Dr. Okafor's methodical forensic testimony and reviewed Danny's premeditation texts, seemed visibly unconvinced by that defense throughout the proceedings. Ruth Callahan testified on the case's 6th day, describing calmly and clearly how Deborah had used similar fraudulent tactics against her years earlier, establishing the pattern prosecutors needed to demonstrate deliberate, repeated conduct rather than an isolated lapse in judgment. Her testimony visibly affected the jury, several members glancing toward Deborah with expressions I recognized as genuine disgust. I testified on the 7th day, walking the jury through months of documented harassment, the forged signature discovery, the overnight paving operation, and the eventual lawful removal of the illegal road from my own property. Priya had prepared me thoroughly, and I kept my testimony factual, unemotional, letting the documented evidence itself carry whatever emotional weight it naturally held. During cross-examination, Deborah's attorney attempted to characterize my excavator removal as evidence of vigilante behavior, suggesting I'd been unreasonably aggressive throughout the dispute. I calmly explained the proper notice given, the licensed contractor hired, and the restraining order already establishing the road's illegal status. Watching the attorney's line of questioning collapse under its own weak foundation. Closing arguments arrived on the 8th day, prosecutors emphasizing the forensic certainty of forgery, the premeditated nature revealed through Danny's texts, and the broader financial fraud harming an entire community's trust. Deborah's attorney argued reasonable doubt existed regarding intent, though even his own closing statement sounded notably less confident than his opening remarks weeks earlier had been. The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours before returning with verdicts on all 4 counts. I sat beside Ruth, holding her hand tightly, as the jury foreperson read each verdict aloud. Slowly, deliberately, in the hushed courtroom where Deborah sat motionless beside her attorney, staring straight ahead without any visible reaction to what was coming. Guilty on forgery. Instruments. Guilty on criminal mischief. Guilty on environmental code violations. For counts. For guilty verdicts. Delivered in the same measured tone a foreperson might use reading grocery totals. Though the weight of those words landed in that courtroom like something enormous finally settling into its rightful place after months of waiting. Deborah's composure finally broke completely, her shoulders collapsing forward as her attorney whispered something beside her. The visor and clipboard confidence that had once dominated 42 households now replaced entirely by something smaller, more human, more afraid than I'd ever witnessed from her throughout this entire exhausting, drawn-out ordeal spanning nearly a full year. Sentencing was scheduled 6 weeks out, allowing time for a pre-sentence investigation report. But the judge's initial comments during the verdict hearing suggested significant consequences were likely, specifically noting a documented pattern of exploiting vulnerable neighbors for personal financial gain. As an aggravating factor, the court would weigh heavily during eventual sentencing proceedings. Outside the courthouse, reporters including Marisol Vega gathered for reaction, and Ruth Callahan, finally given a platform after years of silent shame, spoke first. "Nobody believed me when this happened to me," she said, voice steady despite visible tears. "I hope every neighbor watching learns that documentation and patience eventually win against people like her." I spoke briefly too, keeping my statement simple and grounded, mentioning my grandfather's orchard, the trees that couldn't be replaced, and the neighbors who'd eventually found the courage to tell the truth once given genuine safety to do so. I thanked Priya, Tom, Carl, and Ruth by name, unwilling to let this moment center only on myself. Sentencing arrived 6 weeks later exactly as scheduled, and the judge, citing the established pattern from Ruth's case alongside the extensive documented harm to my orchard and the broader Cedar Hollow community's finances, sentenced Deborah to 4 years in state prison, followed by 5 years probation, alongside substantial restitution obligations to every affected party involved. Restitution included compensation for my destroyed orchard trees based on Dr. Feldman's arborist assessment, wetland restoration costs for the environmental violation, and partial repayment toward the nearly $40,000 in misdirected HOA funds. Though the judge acknowledged full financial recovery for the community would likely take years given Deborah's now severely limited assets. Richard Voss faced separate civil liability for his dissolved development consultancy's role in the scheme, though prosecutors declined criminal charges against him specifically, citing insufficient evidence proving direct knowledge of his wife's forgery. Despite the clearly timed parcel options that had motivated the entire fraudulent scheme from its very beginning months earlier, Danny Voss received his previously negotiated plea agreement sentence, probation, community service, and a suspended contractor's license pending a review process, a considerably lighter consequence, reflecting his eventual cooperation. Though Priya noted his business, Blacktop Brothers, would likely struggle for years given the public nature of his involvement in such a widely covered case. Cedar Hollow's HOA, under Carl's continued interim leadership, formally restructured its bylaws within months, requiring independent verification for any future development proposals, mandatory financial audits every year rather than every 3, and term limits preventing any single president from accumulating the kind of unchecked authority Deborah had wielded for years before anyone challenged her. Carl was eventually elected permanent HOA president the following spring, running unopposed on a platform explicitly built around transparency and accountability. The exact opposite of everything Deborah had represented. He personally invited me to speak at a community meeting about the importance of documentation and standing firm against unchecked authority. An invitation I accepted gratefully. Ruth Callahan received a formal apology from the current Cedar Hollow board, along with a modest financial settlement acknowledging the community's failure to protect her years earlier when Deborah first began this pattern of exploitation. It wasn't full restoration for what she'd lost, but Ruth told me it mattered enormously simply being believed. Finally, after so many years, I used part of my own restitution settlement, once it eventually arrived in installments over the following 2 years, to replant the destroyed section of orchard with new saplings, carefully selected to eventually match the variety and character of what had been lost. Though Dr. Feldman gently reminded me some things, like 40-year-old grafted trees, simply take decades to truly replace. Jake and I decided to name the new planting section Walt's Second Row, honoring my grandfather while acknowledging this wasn't quite the same orchard he'd originally built,
but something new grown deliberately from what remained. Patient and hopeful in exactly the way he'd always approached farming himself, season after difficult season, without complaint.
Lily, now 9, still occasionally mentions the bad road when new visitors ask about the orchard's history, telling the story with the confident, uncomplicated clarity children bring to complicated adult situations. A mean lady built a road on our land without asking, so Mommy got a really big digger and broke it all up. That simplified version, in its own way, captured something essentially true about the entire ordeal. Stripped of legal terminology and forensic reports, someone had taken something that wasn't theirs, believing confidence and authority alone entitled them to it, and eventually, through patience, documentation, and finally decisive action, that taking had been properly, thoroughly undone. Marisol Vega's original article and its follow-up piece eventually won a regional journalism award for local investigative reporting, and she interviewed me one final time for a broader feature about HOA overreach cases across the state, discovering through her research that Deborah's pattern, while extreme, wasn't entirely unique among certain overzealous homeowners association leadership nationwide. That broader context didn't make what happened to Ruth, to me, or to Cedar Hollow's misused finances feel any less personal. But it did clarify something important. This wasn't simply one unusually cruel woman acting alone. It was what happens when communities grant unchecked authority to confident personalities without building in genuine accountability from the very beginning. Priya used our case, with my permission, as a teaching example in a continuing legal education seminar for attorneys handling property disputes, emphasizing the importance of thorough documentation, forensic verification, and patient legal process even when facing someone who seems, initially, unstoppably confident and connected within local bureaucratic systems and county offices. Tom, now well into retirement, took genuine satisfaction watching his old surveying expertise contribute meaningfully toward exposing fraud in his own neighborhood, mentioning more than once how validating it felt after Ruth Callahan's case years earlier, which he'd always regretted not being able to help resolve properly before Deborah's pattern eventually caught up with her. Carl's landscaping business, once quietly threatened by Deborah for his honesty, actually grew significantly following his election as HOA president, as neighboring subdivisions sought him out specifically for his reputation of integrity established throughout this entire ordeal, proving eventually that honesty, however costly initially, tends to build something more durable than fear-based compliance ever could. I still see Deborah's name occasionally in county records regarding her ongoing restitution payments, small increments arriving through the legal system's slow machinery, a permanent reminder that consequences, once properly documented and pursued through legitimate channels, eventually arrive even for people who spent years believing their confidence alone made them entirely untouchable within their community. Richard Voss and Deborah eventually divorced during her second year of incarceration. According to public county records, their beige cedar hollow house sold at a loss to cover mounting legal debts and restitution obligations. The family that once seemed to embody the subdivision's polished ambition scattered entirely by consequences of their own careful, deliberate making. On quiet mornings now, I still walk the northern field where the road once cut through, past Walt's second-row saplings slowly gaining height each season, and feel something settled that took nearly 2 full years to arrive. Not quite peace exactly, but something adjacent to it, earned rather than given, patient rather than rushed. Jake asked me recently whether I do anything differently, looking back at the entire exhausting ordeal from forged signature to courtroom verdict to excavator reclamation. I told him honestly, I'd have called Ruth Callahan sooner, trusted my own instincts about that first surveyor stake a little faster, but otherwise, patience and documentation had genuinely, ultimately, worked exactly as needed. Lily helps water the new saplings most evenings now, taking the responsibility seriously in the particular way young children sometimes surprise you with, and occasionally asks when Walt's second row will finally look like the rest of the orchard. I tell her the truth Dr. Feldman gave me. Some things simply need real time, patient seasons, honest growth. The farm stand business slowly recovered too. Neighbors who'd once avoided eye contact now regular customers again. Several specifically mentioning they appreciated buying from someone who'd stood her ground properly against something that could have easily destroyed a less determined family. I accepted their business gratefully, without needing to relitigate old wounds every single transaction. Priya and I remain in occasional contact even now, her firm having taken on 2 additional HOA fraud cases inspired partly by the regional attention our case eventually received. Each one, she told me, a little easier to pursue having established clear legal precedent for documenting and challenging exactly this pattern of authority-based property fraud. Ruth Callahan visits the orchard twice yearly now, watching Walt's second row grow alongside Lily, telling anyone who'll listen that watching justice eventually arrive for someone else's fraud helped her finally release years of quiet shame she'd carried alone, believing incorrectly that her earlier loss had simply been her own fault for trusting the wrong person. Carl still serves as HOA president, having been re-elected twice since. Cedar Hollow's finances now fully transparent, audited yearly by an independent firm no board member has any personal connection to whatsoever. Exactly the kind of unglamorous, careful governance that prevents confident, manipulative personalities from ever accumulating unchecked authority again quite so easily. Some nights, standing at that kitchen window where I once stared helplessly at fresh black asphalt cutting through my family's history, I instead watch young saplings sway gently in evening wind, imperfect and still growing, proof that patient, documented, deliberate justice, however slow and exhausting it sometimes feels while living through it, genuinely, eventually arrives. I think often about that first night. Headlights crossing the fence line. The smell of hot asphalt through an open bedroom window. And how easily fear or impulsive anger could have derailed everything that eventually followed. Priya's insistence on documentation over confrontation, patience over panic, turned out to be the exact strategy that dismantled someone who'd built her entire identity on unchallenged confidence. Deborah Voss, once the undisputed queen of 42 beige houses, now serves her sentence in a state facility roughly 90 minutes from Cedar Hollow. Her restitution payments arriving in small, steady increments that will likely continue for years beyond her eventual release. Permanent, quiet consequence following someone who genuinely believed she'd never truly be caught. And every apple one cell from the surviving southern rose. Every sapling in Walt's second row that gains another season's growth. Every honest conversation with a neighbor who once doubted me feels like its own small, ongoing testament to something simple I learned throughout this entire exhausting ordeal. Patient truth, properly documented, eventually outlasts even the most confident lies. My grandfather Walt used to say that good soil remembers everything you put into it, good and bad, and eventually shows you exactly what you deserve based on how carefully you tended it. Standing now at the edge of Walt's second row, watching young trees slowly reclaim ground that briefly, wrongly, belonged to someone else's ambition, I finally understand precisely what he meant.